Hello, and welcome to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu Walsh. A pipe dream based on racist impulses for white separation, or a legitimate call for self-determination? Tonight, we explore the heated debate over Western Cape independence. Our guests this evening are scholar and author Dr. Oscar van Heerden, who's here with us in studio, and joining us on Zoom is founder of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, Phil Craig, as well as convener of the Cape Metro Development Forum, Ndithini Kido. Do remember to engage with this topic on Twitter using our handle @UnfilteredSABC. Our question this evening is the idea of an independent and self-determined Western Cape realistic? But first, let's watch this insert produced by Genosi Kweni.
The Western Cape, South Africa's second richest province and GDP contributor according to the International Monetary Fund, easily one of the top cities in the world, and in a country known for its high levels of crime, especially in the urban areas. The province also boasts one of the safest and most accessible city centers in South Africa, Cape Town. It is here where Jan van Riebeeck first arrived in a ship and established what would become known as a colony of the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. And to this day, a province whose history and posture remain contested, one which has not been able to shake off perceptions of racism. Much like the rest of South Africa, wealth and poverty is spread along racial lines, with rich and wealthy whites on the one side and the mostly poor and black residents on the other. A tourist's paradise, the province landscape is a picturesque image of extreme wealth and prosperity, but also poverty and destitution. It is also here where the devastating impact of apartheid spatial planning is still visible for all to see. Poverty-stricken areas, dotted with shacks and non-existent infrastructure, are inhabited by mostly poor black people. What is the psychology behind calls for secession by certain minority parties and advocacy groups in this province still battling racial inequality post-1994? Those calling for self-determination cite the inefficiencies of the ANC-led government. They say the country is falling apart under ANC watch. Ailing infrastructure, the state's inability to provide sufficient electricity, porous borders, crime are just some of the challenges facing South Africa. They also claim that the Western Cape province is well governed under the DA leadership and can stand on its own as an economic powerhouse, unlike other provinces. But those opposing the move have described the idea as bizarre, given the disparity in service delivery, which is skewed towards the more affluent areas at the expense of the poor in the province. Is the idea of self-determination for the Western Cape realistic? Genosi Kweni, Unfiltered, on the SABC channel 404.
Welcome back. Let's dive into our discussion this evening. Mr. Craig, as the person on this panel who advocates for Western Cape independence, why on earth would you propose such a drastic step in a country so unequal? Can you, in a nutshell, explain to us why you support this idea?
Sure. Look, thank you for inviting me here, and hi to my fellow panelists. Look, it's interesting to hear that the way that the Cape independence is there being packaged in that video, because I would say, look, that isn't what Cape independence is about at all. There are aspects of it that are true, and there's a lot of stuff that really kind of is just stuff that distracts from the core issue, and it comes down to democracy. We've got these people in the Western Cape, 7 million people in the Western Cape, 3.2 million voters, and since 1994, the majority of Western Cape voters have never been governed by the party at national government level they're elected. So fundamentally, we've got a democratic system that isn't working for the people of the Western Cape. We fundamentally are making different choices to the people of the rest of the country. And as the rest of the country is governed terribly, then the consequences of decisions that we didn't make are impacting upon the people of the Western Cape. And the basis of Cape independence is, look, we don't have to be cargo, helpless cargo on somebody else's ship. And that's the essence of the right of self-determination, that actually we should be able to captain and steer our own ship and make decisions for ourselves based upon the democratic will of the people living in the Western Cape. And that's all of the people in the Western Cape. It's not based upon a race. It's not based upon anything other. It's all of the people, all 3.2 million voters, and we're pushing for Cape independence based upon a democratic referendum where everybody gets to have their say. And I think all of the other issues, we mustn't get sidetracked into issues like inequality and stuff. We know we've got problems there, and actually we know they have to be solved. And our argument would say those problems will be solved far quicker and far better in an independent Western Cape, where we can make decisions for ourselves, than in a province where actually we can't make any decisions because they're made by central government, and the central government has been elected by somebody else other than us,
right,
who we vehemently disagree.
Okay, so Dr. van Heerden, you've written hard-hitting articles, I suppose equalled by Mr. Craig as well, in opposition to Western Cape independence. Mr. Craig says this is merely a question of democracy. How do you respond?
Well, Sizwe, the thing about democracy is that it's subject to interpretation. The mere fact that people in the Western Cape can express themselves and vote according to what they want, which is not necessarily, as Craig says, in line with the general view, is an element of democracy. I mean, the truth of the matter is that if people genuinely feel that they are not getting what they want from their national government, then you go to the polls and you vote that party out.
Absolutely. Mr. Kido, how do you respond to the argument that Western Cape independence is merely a democratic call?
No, it's not. It's not a democratic call. It's a racist call. It's just Mr. Craig's hatred for black people, especially in the Cape Flats and in the townships. Mr. Craig's attitude is that we are black people in this particular province are a party to white privilege.
Mr. Craig?
Well, look, I think two things. First of all, let's come back to Oscar, and let's be absolutely clear, because this is one of these things that's often offered up, and it's complete nonsense. So to say to the people of the Western Cape, you don't like the national government voted out, is completely nonsensical. We never voted it in. For 30 years, the majority of people in the Western Cape have voted against that national government. We didn't vote it in, and we can't vote it out. That is the whole point. We've been trying for 30 years to vote it out, and we can't. So that's why I want self-determination.
Mr. Craig, can I just ask you there, because on the question of democracy, this question has been put to the Western Cape electorate via the Cape Independence Party, and that party got a staggering 0.01% of the vote in 2016. In 2021, it increased its share of the vote to 0.06. So when you talk about democracy, it doesn't look like the electorate really cares for this question either. So how can it be about democracy on the one hand and have less than 1% support in the electorate on the other?
Well, look, I think we have to separate those two issues, and I'm glad you've raised that, because I think that's another red herring that's often lauded over the Cape. Cape Independence Party is one specific party. It's not the only party that supports Cape Independence. Actually, there were three parties in the last election that advocated for an independent Western Cape, and the Cape Independence Party.
How much did they get combined?
They collectively got 5.3%. But you must remember that the vast majority of Cape Independence supporters vote for the DA, because most Cape Independence supporters want a DA-governed Western Cape. The party they're electing, they want to govern them, as opposed to electing this party, which then doesn't get to govern them. So I think we've got to be really careful, and you know as well as I do that internationally, support for independence is measured in a single-issue referendum and not in elections, and particularly not in local government elections.
Dr. van Heerden?
Well, my response, Mr. Craig, is that you can't have your cake and eat it. On the one hand, you say Western Cape is the best governed province, and you say that because it's governed by the Democratic Alliance, and on the other you say, well, actually it's not governed by the DA, it's governed by the national government. And that's why the people or the voters of the Western Cape wants to secede. I think, you have to be clear. The truth of the matter is that this is a pipe dream. I don't know if it is on racial lines, if indeed all the people of the Western Cape is in agreement. But as you know, Sizwe, even if there is a referendum is not a legal binding document. It doesn't say anything. Even if the Scots decide to vote tomorrow to leave the United Kingdom, if the central government decide that they are not in agreement with that, it's simply not going to happen.
Mr. Kido, how do you respond to the discussion so far, and especially this question of the appetite for independence and whether there actually is a sense of a desire for this, in any sense, let alone a majority sense?
In fact, Sizwe, let's just tell Mr. Craig that the majority of black people in the colored people in the Western Cape are going to go nowhere. And we believe that South Africa is a one independent republic and will remain to one South Africa. I think Mr. Craig must start to wake up and smell the coffee. That what they are trying to do now, they are creating a second DA so that you add the yoke on the necks of the black and the township and the Cape Flats people. I think what they are doing, in fact, they are forcing us all as black people on the other side, away from C Point and the CBD, to start to think along the lines of uniting ourselves, so that where that is possible at all, vote out the very DA that Mr. Craig is boasting about. You see, the reality of the people of Ravensmith, Mitchell's Plain and Khayelitsha, they stare faces in the best run city of Cape Town and the Western Cape. I don't even know what Mr. Craig is talking about.
Mr. Kido, I hear you. I hear you on that, and I think there's no doubt that poverty, inequality, even in racialized terms, is acute in the Western Cape. But some argue that the Western Cape is better governed. It doesn't mean it's well governed, but it's better governed than other provinces in South Africa, and that is actually creating the grounds for this independence movement, because the differential in governance is spurring groups like Mr. Craig's on. How do you respond to that? Do you accept that at least the Western Cape is better governed than other provinces in the country?
No, Caesar, I wouldn't agree with that. You know why? In the 3 police stations, 5 police stations in the top mega stations in the country are found in the Western Cape. So what's best governed there when people are dying like in the same Western Cape that Mr. Craig is trying to tell us? The highest concentration of shack dwellings in the entire republic would be in the Western Cape. Supposedly, Khayelitsha is the 3rd largest townships in the country, but is the number 1 with the highest concentration of shack dwellings, where there are no, still in 2023, where there are no access roads, there are no abolition facilities. Then how do one start talk about best governance? What do we mean by this?
Mr. Craig, how do you respond to that? Because a lot of your platform is based on this idea that there is this differential, that there's this desire in the Western Cape to continue with how it separates itself from the rest of the country. But in actual fact, things are terrible in the Western Cape, aren't they?
Well, look, so I think both questions are true, and I think let's go back to Oscar's comment, because I think that helps us unpack this. Oscar says, well, you can't have it both ways, but you don't have it both ways, and Oscar should know, and I'm sure he does know, that actually we have this quasi-federal system of government. So actually the Western Cape government has a very, very limited number of powers, and that's limited by the Constitution, and over those things it has authority and does the best that it can. But actually over other issues, the central government, and which on most issues, has complete control. So for example, policing is a national government competence. So if you have issues with policing in the Western Cape, the problem is not with the Western Cape government, because the Western Cape government doesn't have any control of policing. It's trying to get control of policing. It's a national government competence. It's a fact. You can shake your head all you like. It's a fact. So we sort of need to get to, and the truth of the Western Cape is this, and I agree with you, the Western Cape, if you compare the Western Cape with other provinces in South Africa, by most objective measures, it vastly outperforms them. It's got far lower unemployment, it's creating the majority of the jobs, it provides better services, it has cleaner audits, it's better governed, it's got less potholes, blah, 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 blah. So the Western Cape is by far the best governed province in South Africa. But if you compare it to its G20 peers, then South Africa's absolutely, the Western Cape is absolutely atrocious. You know, it's got a terribly high unemployment rate, it's got huge social problems, and actually they will be better at, the question is, how do we best fix those?
Yeah, absolutely, and I want to bring in our other guests as well on that. We're going to go to a break. Having surveyed the question more generally, we're going to come on to whether this is a racial question and not just one of governance after the break. Stick with us. Welcome back to Unfiltered. I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, and we're discussing Western Cape independence. Before we continue with our conversation, just some context in terms of the demographics. Let's look at the demographics of the biggest city within the Western Cape in terms of race, and that's Cape Town. As you'll see, coloured South Africans or South Africans racialized as coloured make up 42.4% of the population, Black African 38.6%, white 15.7%, and Indian or Asian South Africans 1.4% of the population. Other, or often those who don't subscribe to the racial categorizations or self-identify, 1.9%. So that's just a sense of context in one of the key areas of the Western Cape, the city of Cape Town, and that opens up a wider debate about the question of race and how that question plays into this conversation. Before we get there, Dr. van Heerden, you wanted to just come back on this point in our conversation about the Western Cape and whether it is indeed better governed than other provinces. And then we'll zoom in on this question of race on the back of that.
Yes, I wanted to just mention, Sizwe, that you know, I hear often people making this reference, and the truth of the matter is, and Mr. Craig knows this, when you talk of other provinces in the country, you talk of provinces where historically, under apartheid, there were Bantustan in those territories. The Western Cape was spared of this. There's no Bantustan that was there in the Western Cape. The development in the Western Cape, because, as we just see with the statistics, the majority of citizens were so-called coloureds. Better schools, better clinics, better hospitals. There was more spent on a so-called coloured child in relation to a Black African child. And so this is a province that the DA has inherited. And so they must not come from a premise that says they have improved the Western Cape. They already got a Western Cape that was far on the scale beyond the other 8 provinces. And I think that's an important point.
Mr. Craig, that's on the point of the governance, but Dr. van Heerden also does take us into the question of history here, and that's a question that you haven't confronted. You've spoken about democracy in the present, but the charge against your group and other groups pushing for Cape independence is that, in actual fact, this is a surreptitious attempt to create a state that is controlled by white people, and to use democracy and all these other questions of governance as a smokescreen, because this is the only chance you get to govern a state. You don't have a majority in South Africa, and so you're trying to cordon yourself off into the corner of South Africa where you do have a certain degree of political power, and this is ultimately a racial power play. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'd say it's absolute utter nonsense. You just put the figures on the screen yourself. We're campaigning for Cape independence based on the democratic will of the people in the Western Cape. You can't simultaneously suggest that somehow this is about white supremacy whilst pointing out that only 15% of the population is white, and we would need 50% plus one support.
Mr. Craig, can I remind you of how a white minority has actually managed to exert significant influence over South African politics. It's not necessarily just about the number of white South Africans, but it's about the balance of white South Africans in the Western Cape versus other parts of the country.
Well, look, let's be honest. It's not about that. This is about the Western Cape and the people who live there. And actually, it was absolutely wrong to exclude people on the basis of their skin from voting. And yes, that absolutely was a part. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about everybody getting a vote. And I think I think it's too easy to just roll out the race blanket. I mean, it's just a cheap shot and silly, and it's almost not worth debating on, because I mean, it doesn't stand credibility for 1 second. And actually, I would ask you a different question. What does the Western Cape get out of its relationship with South Africa? What's in it for the people of the Western Cape to remain in a relationship with South Africa? And that's a far better question. And if you can answer the question of what the Western Cape gets out of that relationship, then perhaps we can explore whether it's racist.
Okay,
but you can't give any good reason for being there.
Mr. Craig, I'm going to be asking the questions, and my question is, I look at your organization, I look at the Cape Independence Party, I look at all the organizations in the Western Cape Working Group, and I don't see one organization led by a black South African. So to say that this has nothing to do with race, when every single one of the organizations involved is led by a white South African, how can you ignore the obvious and palpable racial dynamics of that call and call it nonsensical when you don't have any black people in your organizations actually advocating for this question?
But we do, and actually, this is where you're just fundamentally wrong. If you look,
how many in the Cape Independence Advocacy Group?
So we're a lobby group. So we're not a big organisation. We've got an exco of about 10 people, and 20% of our exco is black. 20% of our exco is coloured, and about 60% of our exco is white.
And you think that's we've just seen the demographics of the Western Cape, so there's a chronic overrepresentation of white voices.
No, that depends on your base. That depends if you think racial representativity is a requirement. First and foremost, there isn't Cape Independence isn't supported equally amongst races. We know that about 80% of white people support Cape Independence, about 50% of coloured people support Cape Independence, and about 20% of black people support Cape Independence. So actually, to a certain extent, we're representative of Cape Independence supporters. And if you go and look and see when we've marched, you'll see that our marches were extraordinarily multiracial. And I think you just must be careful of not just throwing out these cheap shots with no real basis for it. And if you want to have a conversation and you want me to provide you data to show you that this is a multiracial organisation, then absolutely we've got a multiracial team, we've got multiracial followers. This is not about whites. I am relevant. You're not going to believe me anyway, and I don't really care whether you do or you don't. But I'm profoundly non-racial. Now, my definition of non-racialism probably differs from yours because I'm not into democratic representativity.
Well,
I'm into merit, but I'm profoundly non-racial.
Okay.
I'm not going to apologise for that.
Okay. Well, Mr. Kido, you introduced the question of race earlier. Mr. Craig says this has nothing to do with race. Happy coincidence that these organizations happen to have an overrepresentation of white voices. What's your view on that?
No, look, Caesar, I don't know whether Mr. Craig is still asleep or doesn't hear what he's saying himself. He says 20% of his organization are black people, but we are also aware that they rent people to come to these marches, as they do to fund mainstream media campaigns to push for this nonsensical independence for the Western Cape. And the other thing that we want to make clear to Mr. Craig, then the 80% that is not calculating is saying no to independence in the Western Cape. We will not allow for any independence in fact, in the Western Cape, we're still fighting the old struggles for the harmonization of racial relations in the Western Cape, also pushing back the stubborn apartheid spatial planning, which creates problems for even the policing he was referring to national government. The police commission, the commission that was created by Premier Helen Zille at the time, headed by Judge Kate Oregon and the Advocate Pikoli, picked up a number of urban design issues that's got nothing to do with actual policing, but with an area with urban design conducive for police to function better so that they can save people from murder. So Mr. Craig is racist. He is having racist undertones. If it were up to Mr. Craig, all black people must be shipped out of the Western Cape.
Mr. Craig, just because there's some serious allegations, can I come back to you on that? How do you respond to that view?
Look, I mean, it's offensive drivel if you could take it seriously. I can't take it seriously. It's complete nonsense. This man's never met me. He's decided I'm racist. He's pronouncing all sorts of facts which are absolute nonsense. I absolutely, the prospect that I want black people out of the West. If he's read anything I've written, you'll see that I write regularly and from the heart about my passion for people of all races. So actually, it's drivel. I don't care. He can say what he likes. At the end of the day, it's just stupid. Let's just move on and discuss something sensible, please.
Well, I mean, I think this is a perfectly sensible debate to be having. It's a key question. It's a key contour of South African life. But Dr. van Heerden, you earlier when we alluded to race weren't so sure whether this actually is a question of race or not. And there's a legitimate debate to be had there as well. What's your view on the extent to which this is a racially coded question, or whether this is a question of governance and democracy and independence?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, Sizwe, the question that must be asked is, why is it that the majority of people in the Western Cape, as Mr. Craig indicates, continuously vote for the Democratic Alliance? And I think therein lies an answer. I think that for the longest time, the DA government, perhaps others, have played on the race card, have played this issue of swart gevaar, and have made the majority of voters in the Western Cape feel at ease with a predominantly white DA government. And this has been the voting pattern for a long time. The very issue that Mr. Craig raises about a referendum and or the people of the Western Cape voting is because he's playing on that very issue, that he's hoping that the majority of so-called colored people that continuously vote for the DA is the ones that's going to say they want to be separate because of the race element. So to say that there's no race in this issue is disingenuous. To come back to the point about policing, the reality is, I'm from the Western Cape. My mother, my family, everyone is in the Western Cape. I know what happens in the Western Cape, and the truth of the matter is that the apartheid spatial morphology in terms of the layout of Cape Town is very much intact. And when you look at the police or any other service provision, it is on those racial lines that it takes place.
Absolutely. We continue our conversation and our debate about Western Cape independence. Join us for a continuation after the break as we delve into questions of the Constitution and delve further into this idea of policing and crime and safety. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're debating the question of Western Cape independence. Is it realistic or a pipe dream? Is it about purely democratic desires, or is there a question of racism hiding behind it? Now, we've discussed a number of themes as we've continued, but I want to go deeper into this question. And Mr. Craig, you've mentioned the DA, particularly in our conversation about how people are feeling about this question, saying that if they're voting for the DA, that might indicate there's a greater appetite for Western Cape independence. But isn't the DA in some ways fooling you and playing both sides? On the one hand, joining your working group, but on the other hand, disavowing this idea of independence. In fact, the DA doesn't support Western Cape independence at all. Or if they do, they also don't support the opposite position in many cases. So this working group is an attempt to placate you while maintaining a majority, isn't it?
First and foremost, it's not an assumption. We've polled, so we've done professional polling, so we know who Cape independence voters for. So it's it's not that I have any particular affinity for or against the DA. That's just the reality of the polling data, and we've polled twice professionally, so we know that's the case, and that's just the reality of where we are.
Can we come to that poll before we carry on? Because
sure.
I mean, one of them was conducted by Victory Research. And a cursory glance at Victory Research reveals that, one of the two people used to actually work for the DA for 12 years. And that poll says that a majority of people support a referendum. But supporting a referendum doesn't mean you support independence. It just means you support a vote. So the poll actually found, even this poll on which you rely, that most people don't want Cape independence. So your poll says that a majority of, I believe, 49% actually oppose, according to the Victory Research poll that you rely on.
Yeah, no, so look, we polled twice, and there was significant movement from the first year to the second year. And the last time we polled, 46% of registered voters supported Cape independence, and 58% of Western Cape voters supported a referendum. And look, and I think that would be natural. You'd normally expect to have a higher level of support. It's polling, and ultimately we'll only be able to determine the final outcome in a referendum. And obviously these ideas take time and momentum. You can't hold a poll and say, look, only 46% of people want Cape independence, so we don't need to have a vote. And you certainly can't argue we had 46% polling, but only 1% of people want Cape independence. So look, I think let's put that to one side. The polling is Victory Research is a well-known, well-respected polling organisation using international best practice.
Well, they didn't cover themselves in glory in predicting the 2021 election either. But I think the fact of the matter is that nobody actually wants this, Mr. Craig. Isn't that right? I mean, we've spoken about the 0.1% of the Cape Independence Party. Your own polls are saying that there's a majority or even 50-50, and I question those polls. So really, I mean, this is a pipe dream, is it not? Nobody's actually advocating for this except a few fringe groups. Look, I'm sorry, but look, I appreciate you want to get a reaction, but look, there's two professional polls. The DA and other organisations have done their own research. Ironically, the Franz Cronje's organisation has recently polled this, not released the data because they said it's too explosive in support of Cape independence or independence and so on. And actually, you have organisations also then like Cape Exit who've stayed out of the political space, where 1 in 4 of every single Western Cape voters has signed up with their ID number and said, I will vote leave in a referendum, which is is quite remarkable. So the notion of, we've had 2 major marches where obviously they've been very well attended. So the notion that people don't support Cape, and nobody really believes that. You only have to fact this programme's taking place. That suggests that fine well there's a substantial level of support for Cape independence, as do other organisations. So look, this programme's happening because we just want to have a number of debates about important questions. It's not because we think Cape independence is going to happen tomorrow. But look, on the question of the DA.
Yeah, that's a better question.
Well, look. Let me decide which questions. I think we've already established that the data behind the cause is not as solid as you earlier suggested. But
we haven't. You've just alluded to that. We haven't established that at all.
Hold on, Mr. Craig. Let me finish the question. I mean, you're yet to show us any independent data which shows a landslide, except for some poll that's being hidden because apparently it's too explosive. Well, let's see this super explosive poll that's being hidden. But let's come back to the DA. The DA has said explicitly, John Steenhuisen, Gordon Hill-Lewis, the mayor of the city of Cape Town, has said they agree with one South Africa. They disagree with Cape independence. So how do you draw this conclusion that people who vote for the DA also support your cause?
Well, okay, at the risk of repeating myself, because we've polled it professionally and twice, and actually the leaders of the DA concede themselves. Certainly you have to ask that they accept that the majority of their Western Cape voters support Cape independence, but you're quite right that the DA itself as an organisation does not support Cape independence. It does support, however, self-determination for the Western Cape. And I think when you talk about self-determination, you have to look at what is self-determination. And self-determination, if you look to the United Nations, it's about people making decisions for themselves. I've got it just before 2021, ironically, Helen Ziller tweeted something, and she said, the DA has always supported federalism and will continue driving devolution of power and regional autonomy. Where people don't vote for the ANC, they don't deserve to live under a failed state. Now, that was obviously a political statement and a moral statement, but actually that is effectively the legal definition for self-determination, that everybody has this right to make decisions for themselves and determine how and by whom they're governed, and to live out their existence. Now self-determination can be applied in 3 primary ways: devolution or autonomy, federalism, or Cape independence.
And we're talking about independence today. But so I think you've expressed your point on the DA and where it sits, Dr. Van Heerden.
Well, I haven't, to be honest.
Hold on, Mr. Craig. We have 2 other guests here who we do need to bring in. We will give you another opportunity. Dr. Van Heerden, how do you respond to the debate as it's played out so far on this question of the DA and Western Cape support as well for this question?
Well, the legality of the issue, I mean, as far as, firstly, everyone, especially the DA and many white South Africans and black, but particularly white South Africans, hold the constitution of South Africa in very high regard. Best constitution. It protects private property rights. It protects many white privileges, among other things. And yet, when it comes to Cape independence, they now want to trample all over the constitution. Because the constitution, in terms of the supreme law, is very clear. It's not even a debate, it's academic. I think it's important that we debate this issue. But from a legal point of view, I think Pierre de Vos has expressed himself on this as one of our constitutional experts and made it very clear that the sections and provisions in the Constitution does not allow for the kind of segregation and the kind of separation that Mr. Craig is advocating. And may I just also add, because I saw that they also talk of constantly referring to the United Nations and other independent sovereign nations that must support them in this effort to create independence. They can have the whole world supporting it. It doesn't mean it's going to happen.
We continue our debate on Western Cape independence after this break, and we'll come back and talk about the constitutionality of this call. Join us after the break. Welcome back to Unfiltered. We're debating the thorny question of Western Cape independence. And we're going to move on to a conversation about the constitutionality and the constitutional intricacies of this question. But before we do that, Mr. Kido, I'd just like to bring you in because we had quite a heated debate in the previous segment, and to see if there's anything you'd like to add to where the conversation has gone so far.
No, thank you very much, Caesar. I just think that I want to align my thinking to what Dr. Van Heerden was saying. Look, Mr. Craig, it would appear that they use this platform to advance a deep-seated hatred for black people in the West. This thing is not going to stand in any court of law to try and push anyone or everyone to. When you say everyone, you include the exact ones you want to exclude in your call. So this thing is not going to see a day of light in court, but it's just that Mr. Craig and his group are creating a platform for themselves to express deep feelings of not, or maybe hate is too harsh, probably not wanting to see black people because only what they believe to be a preserve for white only, which is the Western Cape.
Dr. Van Heerden, and Mr. Kido has now alluded to this legal question. I mean, this would require massive constitutional rearrangements. I mean, just that the sheer constitutional practicalities are surely inconceivable?
I think so. You know, there's been many a times, of course there has been changes to the Constitution. Not many South Africans know that. The legislature has on occasion changed a few things as we go along. But this calls for a fundamental change within the Constitution of South Africa. And I think it is going to be quite a mountain to climb. Unlike Mr. Craig, who thinks this decision lies only with the Western Cape, when it comes to a two-thirds majority in the national legislature to actually push through legislation that accommodates this wish, this pipe dream, I don't think it's going to be attained.
Before I come to you, Mr. Craig, I think that the one question I also have for you, Dr. Van Heerden, is to what extent do you think ANC failures have actually opened the door for this kind of conversation? You know, if the country was better governed, then maybe this conversation about the country would be pushed even further to the margins than it really is. But to be fair, Mr. Craig says, here we are at prime time discussing this conversation. Is the ANC government's failure responsible for widening the window to these kinds of secessionist conversations?
I don't think so. I think that's a cop-out argument. I don't think the ANC is experiencing their glory days. Not at all. I mean, there's many challenges in South Africa, across the country. Policing is not only a problem in the Western Cape, it's a problem in all provinces. Crime is off the charts. There's all sorts of mafias and so forth. Infrastructure, service delivery. There's a plethora of challenges that this ANC government obviously face, and citizens have the right to hold them to account. But to say you want to secede because you are not in agreement with how the country is managed, imagine, where do we draw the line? Today the Western Cape, tomorrow the KZN, etc., etc. No sane government is going to allow this kind of move to happen, regardless, and I want to emphasize, regardless of a referendum or external support for such a move. I just think it's not going to happen. And then the other thing I want to say, Sizwe, is around the devolution issue. because I see we're using the term interchangeably and so forth. I mean, I think that there is an argument to be had for further devolution of powers to provincial parliaments and provincial legislatures and so forth, but that is a legitimate debate. If you want to use that argument and devolution towards an agenda of secession, then there's no doubt that you're going to get resistance even for the devolution.
Mr. Craig, how do you respond to that and a series of questions, but also the constitutional impracticalities of your proposal for independence?
So I think that, look, let's just very quickly understand that there's these three parts of self-determination: the devolution, federalism, and independence. Two of those are internal self-determination, devolution and federalism, and the other one is external. And they have different legal requirements. So devolution is largely voluntary. The Western Cape government was elected on a ticket of devolution. It's asked for devolution. The national government has refused to give it devolution of policing and other issues. So that's kind of been tried. Then we next move on to federalism. Federalism requires a change of the constitution. There are some ways that can be done, and I think that'll unfold in the next few weeks. Perhaps
I'm just saying we're discussing independence, so we hear you on.
I'm coming to there because I think it's important to understand that federalism requires a change of the constitution. Independence doesn't require a change of the constitution. Once you move on to independence, it's about provisions of international law. And fundamentally, if a country secedes, it's like claiming that you need to change the constitution. It's like saying you can't get divorced because you've got a marriage certificate. So if we get to the point of independence, and normally these things, and the reason I include the others is because in international law they scale up. You know, the international community would prefer internal self-determination. But actually, the national government's already declined one form of internal self-determination. And actually, if we get a federalism bill, and by the way, we're writing one, and we bring a federalism bill and Parliament declines federalism for the Western Cape, and then you're left at independence. And then and at that point, then you come into the provisions of international law. And bear in mind that, first of all, you then don't need constitutional approval. That's been clear from the International Court of Justice in 2010 in the Kosovo case. We've had pivotal cases both from the Supreme Courts of Canada and the Supreme Court of the UK saying that referendums, effectively, even if they're not binding, they're binding, and democratic countries can't ignore the outcomes. And in any case, the South African Constitution recognises self-determination and recognises the authority explicitly of international law.
So, Mr. Craig,
so the legal case is strong.
Well, I'm not so sure myself. I mean, firstly, you'd be saying that all the people of South Africa, all 60 million, wouldn't have a say in whether the Western Cape, who would be affected deeply by any kind of independence, wouldn't have a say. So this referendum is, again, carefully tailored so that you can have the electorate you want and not the electorate that matters here. But secondly, I mean, Section 1 of the Constitution starts with the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic republic. And the schedules, Schedule 4, the other schedules of the Constitution which deal with the maps of South Africa clearly state the Western Cape is part of South Africa. So to say this doesn't invoke any constitutional questions is surely pie in the sky. You'd have to amend the South African Constitution, and amending Section 1 requires 75% majority, 6 provinces. And to say that the South African people wouldn't have a say in that would surely just be outlandish.
Well, let's just split the two, because I think there's two issues, because I think both are correct. So first of all, if you look at independence referendums around the world, there's been something like 35 in the last 3 decades, and you'll see that in every single one, only the seceding territory got to vote. So there's no question that only the Western Cape gets to vote. But having then voted, there has to be a negotiation between South Africa, or Western Cape and South Africa. And actually, if you want to go to the UK, the Canadian Supreme Court, they've laid that out very well, that kind of said, look, the Western Cape can't then just do what it likes, but neither can South Africa ignore, or in that case, Canada, ignore Quebec's desire for secession, and therefore they must get together and negotiate how it's going to happen, with a specific reference to minority rights and with specific reference to impact of everybody. And it says, look, no outcome is predetermined in law, but clearly, everybody's interest must be taken into consideration. So the people of South Africa are considered, but they definitely don't get to vote, and they don't get to dictate to the Western Cape any more than fairness than the Western Cape in the first reckoning gets to dictate to South Africa.
Can I ask you, okay, thank you for that response, Mr. Craig. Mr. Chido, in 30 seconds, could I ask for your final reflections on our conversation?
Thank you very much, Caesar. I think I will take Mr. Craig up on that offer for coffee. Mr. Craig must start to wake up. Western Cape is still in South Africa still. So there will be no negotiation between South Africa and the Western Cape. Thank you very much, Caesar.
Mr. Chido, Mr. Craig, Dr. van Heerden, thank you very much for a spirited and fascinating conversation. We've covered constitutional questions, questions of race, questions of democracy. Will the Western Cape call for independence grow, or is this merely a fringe movement which should be dismissed? Thanks for joining us. We'll see you on the next installment of Unfiltered. Have a good evening.